Hey guys, welcome to my video about the meta post-nerf. So in a couple of weeks Blizzard's going to be nerfing Small Time Buccaneer and Spirit Claws, and this video is going to be about what I think, which deck will be the best, and how the metagame will look like after the patch. To start off with the video, I want to talk about I guess some assumptions I'm going to make on how Hearthstone works and which decks generally counter what. So I guess the first thing I want to state is that for the history of Hearthstone, I've come to the conclusion that for the most part aggro decks have beat mid-range decks, and mid-range decks have beaten control decks, and control decks have beaten aggro. It's kind of like the cycle of life as far as the archetype goes. I'm going to be leaving out combo decks from this discussion because each one is kind of weird in its own way, and they all operate kind of differently. Also, Blizzard's kind of phasing them out in general, taking out like OTK combos and things like that. So it's probably not even that relevant going to the future of the game. And the reason why I think that this cycle is true is because, one, Hearthstone is a board control game where the aggressor has the option to dictate minion trades. The second thing I want to say is, so what happens is control decks, you generally combat early aggression through AoE and removal, whereas mid-range decks kind of try to duke it out with minions, right? So that's the reason why I think aggro decks have generally beaten mid-range decks, because mid-range decks are just dropping minions into a player with already board control, whereas control decks have the extra removal and just AoE to make a comeback and perhaps healing as well. Mid-range decks can also just run as many big threats as control decks, things like Tyrion and Ragnaros, even some more like anti-control, 6-drops like Karen instead of Sylvanas, things like that. So mid-range decks also have like access to like things like Quartermaster before, now they have the Jade mechanic. So, but it's like they can basically run as much value as control decks, but in the slots where control decks run AoE, they generally run more mid-range minions, which are generally between like 3 and 5 drops. It count as kind of mid-range minions, depending on how small the 3-drop is, I guess. So my fairly bold assumption here is that all 3 archetypes will always be played unless Blizzard goes extremely off in the balance, but they're going to tune their deck lists according to what is dominant in the meta, and that this is very much so self-correcting. So unless something drastically goes wrong with card balance before an expansion, there's always going to be aggro and mid-range and control decks in the meta. No matter which deck or archetype is the most dominant, the meta will always kind of self-correct itself, because that's just kind of how the Nash equilibrium works. If too many people play one deck, a few people playing another deck will be able to counter that deck and that archetype in general. So right now, it's clear that it's an aggro meta, and from what we see right now, you have anti-aggro, aggro shaman, right? People running all these like board control tools like Maelstrom Portal. Mid-range decks just are not very strong in general. So Jade Druid and Dragon Priest, for example, are probably the two best mid-range decks, and they're not very common because it's hard for them to tune enough. But if you look at how they tune, they run Dragon Priest running Potion Madness, Swamp Ooze, Druids running Double Feral Rage, things like that. So they are trying to tune against aggro as well. And if you look at the control decks, yeah, that's the counter to aggro in general, but they also tune very much so against aggro. But I want to say that cycle is only in a general sense. I believe any archetype can tune towards another one. So for an example, I do believe that an anti-Druid Reno Mage can beat an anti-aggro Jade Druid. But for a natural order of things, an anti-Druid Reno Mage will probably lose to an anti-Reno Jade Druid if they both go 100% on each other. So by going 100%, I mean, as the Druid player, if all you're trying to do is beat Reno Mage, and as Reno player, if all you're trying to do is beat Jade Druid, I do think that the Jade Druid will come out ahead, but right now Jade Druids are tuned anti-aggro and Reno Mages are tuned anti-aggro, but I believe that if Jade Druid just stay the same and Reno Mages, so I'm going to be talking about this in the later parts of my video for a lot of example deck lists before I make my assertion on what I think the best deck will be. Alright, so if we take a look at the current deck lists, and you can probably see that for the most tournaments and ladder deck lists, they are tuned pretty anti-aggro. So yeah, okay, let's talk about post-patch now. Post-patch, I am gonna make an assertion that Spirit Claws and Small Time Buccaneer will not be played anymore. This is my assumption based on the analysis of the parallel cards post-patch. A 1-mana 1/1 that goes into 3/1 after you equip the weapon, you know, is not strong enough. It's just simply not that good. 2-mana Spirit Claws is not even, you know, remotely close to being good as well. When I say close, because it's only 1-mana difference, so you could say it's close, but it's not realistic. Like, it has to be better than other stuff, and it's not. A 2-mana 1/3 weapon that you have to have then later on roll spell power, you know, or play something like Blood Mage is not nearly strong enough, I think. So yeah, you can't play Spirit Calls turn 1 and then, you know, curve out after there with your hero powers and other minions. It's kind of something you have to dedicate your entire turn to early, and not just like kind of an afterthought or a turn 1 if you missed your 1-drop play. Anyways, I am predicting a mid-range meta post-nerf with all 3 archetypes targeting mid-range decks like Jade Druid and Dragon Priest first and foremost, but they're the only mid-range decks. So let's take an example of some of my post-patch deck lists that I am making up here. First one to look at, potentially like an aggro shaman. This shaman, let's see. So I don't think that shaman will be playing pirates post-patch, because out of the 3 patched classes right now, which are shaman, warrior, and rogue, shaman has the weakest patches synergy, but is still playing patches. Because shaman has no neutral, shaman has no class pirates, right? Whereas warrior has N'Zoth's First Mate, and rogue has Swashbuckler. Warrior and rogue also have easier access to weapons post-patch, because rogue obviously just hero powers, and warrior has, first of all, warrior has Fire War Axe, and second of all, warrior has N'Zoth's First Mate, which also generates the weapon. So N'Zoth's First Mate is like, you know, an anchor to the pirates, because it's both a pirate and a weapon to activate other pirates like Sassy Deckhand. So because both Buccaneer and Spirit Calls is being taken out of Shaman, at that point, even if you do run Sassy Deckhand, you only have the early game Jade Claws, 2 weapons, not really enough to run pirates, I believe. So this is maybe, you know, I've seen like Frozen run like stuff like, you know, this Vinja package. I've seen some people run Hammer Twilight. You can also run this kind of deck with Doomhammer, but you know, if I did say it's a mid-range oriented meta, and aggro shaman has a pretty good like Jade mechanic here, I do believe that like having something like Hammer of Twilight to generate the 4/2 and Vinja to make that, you know, explosive board against something like Jade Druid is pretty good. So this is kind of my take on aggro shaman post-patch. As you can see, it looks a lot weaker than before. Not nearly as explosive without the pirates. Also, my last note on this deck is, without the density of early game proactive minions, we have 2 Tunnel Trogs and 1 Sir Finley, and then we have only 2 Totem Golems. Like, we just can't have the consistency of, like, aggro shaman in the past has always been kind of inconsistent, right? Because they can always kind of curve out, like, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 into, you know, Flamer's Faceless, into Burn, into Doomhammer. It's always felt kind of unstoppable, sometimes if it's curved out. But the reason why aggro shaman's so strong now is it always curves out, right? Because you have so many different kinds of minions you can curve out. You can still go Tunnel Trog and Totem Golem and Feral Spirits, and then and Flame Wreath, or you could go for the pirate opening. Like, you just have other things as well. And Flame Tongue is also gonna be weaker in this deck than before. So I do think that aggro is getting hit a lot. As far as Pirate War, I didn't make a deck for post-patch, but I still think that Pirate War will be played, just a fair bit weaker. Alright, let's go on to, like, so this is one of my examples of an anti-mid-range Reno lock, right? Because if we want to target Jade Druid and Dragon Priest, now things like Cruel is very powerful, because those kind of decks generally don't have great board clears, and sometimes, you know, Draxus is not even the best play against something like Jade Druid. They're too fast, and it's hard to actually play it and be safe sometimes. But anyways, if you pull out, you know, a 3/15 and then you Argus it, it's fine as well. So this is kind of one of my examples. I kind of like Sense Demons to just try to hit that critical mass of demons for Cruel. It's also Demon as well as Felguard. Because with this deck, you have your mana curve is much higher than the anti-aggro Reno decks of nowadays. You're probably not going to even have to play Felguard anytime around turn 3. You know, kind of just like how Blast Crystal Potion is. Like, the closer to turn 10 you play it, the less the mana matters. So Felguard's really cool in this list, because you can either play it close to turn 10 and just have other stuff to do in the mid game, or you can just, you know, pull it out with Cruel, and this has a good amount of demons. I think this deck will give, you know, Jade Druid and Dragon Priest kind of a run for its money. It's a good place to start post-patch, maybe, depending on how aggro goes. This is my example of a anti-mid-range Reno mage. As you can see, it's kind of very similar to Life Coach's list of some of the weeks or months in the past. You have the deck being built around, say, Medivh and Sylvanas. So you have like a lot of these big, you know, bombs that Jade Druid has a hard time dealing with, like Emperor and Sylvanas and Antonidas and Medivh. Inkmaster is much better. Like, I don't play Inkmaster currently. A lot of people do. Regardless, though, it's not that great against aggro. Like, I don't think anyone's arguing that it's a great card against aggro. People just want to play it, you know, just because it's the power level of the card's pretty high. I also don't think Inkmaster is great against other control decks because control matchups, depending on which control matchup, Reno Mage Mirror is not very tempo-based either, but, you know, it's pretty good against Reno Lock. Anyways, it's really, really good against mid-range decks, because mid-range against control is all about tempo. Again, you hit like a 0 mana 5/5, so this is kind of maybe a place to start post-patch. Now I'm going to do my Jade Druid post-patch. This is kind of like a Jade Druid. Potentially you're cutting Living Roots and Feral Rage, because those are kind of the anti-aggro cards now, and you can either... It depends how the meta is shaping up post-patch, but if people are playing like almost all mid-range decks and that becomes a dominant archetype, I think this is pretty good. If the Reno decks are still actually giving Jade Druid a run for its money because they're teched for mid-range, I could see this deck running double Gadgetzan Auctioneer to keep up with the card. You know, card draw is just super good. Anyways, against mid-range Mirror, you know, having 2 Gadgetzan is not too great. It's mostly about tempo, so having some extra cards like Druid of the Claw and extra Ancient of Wars and Sylvanas and Ragnaruses are kind of like my 4 tech cards that I put in instead of the Feral Rages and the Living Roots. To kind of like finish up my video, I am gonna like predict that Jade Druid will be the strongest deck post-patch. I think that the aggro decks have taken a fair beating with the Small Time Buccaneer and the Spirit Claws nerfs, and I think that a lot of decks will be targeted towards mid-range decks in the future. But yeah, I do think the meta is extremely self-correcting, and all existing archetypes will still be played, but for different purposes than before. I guess what I want to like end this video with kind of like, you know, like a kind of like a call to action, I guess, of, you know, like maybe to get the community or the internet hive mind, you know, everyone to analyze how true some of my points have been, because in other card games, like, it's definitely not true that aggro beats mid-range, mid-range beats control, and control beats aggro. It's actually the complete opposite, where control decks beat mid-range and mid-range decks beat aggro, like Magic the Gathering, because... But I think that's based on some of the core mechanics of the game, where Hearthstone, the attacker has the initiative, so if you're a little bit faster than someone in Hearthstone, you can take all the good board trades. Whereas in a card game like Magic, the defender has the initiative. You know, 1/2/2 minion can beat 4 1/1 minions in Magic just one at a time. It's kind of how the game works. You know, you can't attack minions in Magic the Gathering. You can only attack the face, and they can just block the minion they want to, and they'll kill it, you know, for value. So that's why I do want to talk about this. And then the main thing I guess I want to talk about, or, you know, if other people talk about it in the comments and see how true it is that I do think that, like, all 3 archetypes will always be played unless, you know, something really goes off on the balance testing of Blizzard, because it's just like, I guess it's just how I think that the Nash equilibrium and kind of how the metagame works. You know, no deck can ever take over, and there's always like a clear, or, you know, very almost clear what the best decks are quickly after an expansion, and it doesn't mean that the other decks aren't played. It's just it just seems like the whole meta like kind of tunes towards, it's like self-correcting, you know. It's like I guess remember post Karazhan when mid-range Shaman was the best, and you have like they're all just fighting against each other, but at that point, like, none of the aggro decks are good because the mid-range decks kind of were too strong. But, like, I guess, I don't know, it just, yeah, I guess I just want to maybe talk about that kind of cycle and how true that is, and how true all 3 archetypes will always be played, you know, because I think that personally the meta is really self-correcting. Alright, well, thanks for watching my video. TLDR, Jade Druid #1, and the meta will be changing to counter that deck. Alright, bye guys.